Hello everyone, if you are a lover of books, you are in the right place because my name is Seamus and this is a novel review, a book podcast where every week I explore a different book. And this week, of course, is no different. This week I'm doing Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. We are in May, which means we are kicking off a new month. If you're new here, this year for 2025, I am doing a book world tour where every month I try to go to, or I'm going to go to a different country through books and read two books from that respective country. So I've been to Italy, Germany, Chile, Japan, and now we're off to Nigeria. So I try to find a male and a female author. They have to be born there and writing about that respective country and culture. And so it's just a great way to sort of widen the reading, the scope of my reading, my books, I should say, to sort of explore a different culture and stuff like that and see the similarities between, I guess, the culture in the two books that I'm reading, but also if there's any threads between the wider cultural landscape. I have started to see a few threads appear across cultures and similarities between us, so that's really cool. So yeah, I can't believe we're already in May and heading to Nigeria, which is cool, but also kind of frightening as well because 2025 is flying by. But yes, that's what I'm going to be speaking about today. First, I just want to say thanks so much for clicking on. I really do appreciate it. I hope we are all well. I hope we've got a lovely cup of tea, cup of coffee, something stronger perhaps. I hope we've got some good books that we're reading. And yeah, just thanks so much for clicking on. If you would like to click the duck in the corner, I'd really appreciate that. But if not, just sit back and enjoy the show. Okay, let's get on with the episode. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, first of the Nigerian books. Really, really great book, actually. Definitely the best book I've read for the Book World Tour and going to be quite tough to beat, I think. Not that I set off on this challenge to sort of find the best book out of the 24 books that I'm going to be reading. But this one was fantastic. Really great book, and I think it's going to be really difficult to beat. First things first, it is the Penguin Modern Classics. I always forget to start the episode by saying, the translation and the edition of it. He wrote it in English, so there is not a translation for this. So that's very cool, but that's just so you guys at home know what particular edition I was reading, because I do read out some quotes and everything like that. So yeah, let's kick things off. Let's start with an overview. This book is largely about, it's this fella called Okonkwo, and he is head of his house. He's got a few wives and many children, and he's a very manly man. He's a very man's man. We might even say a toxic man, and he's living in Nigerian society. He's, one of the respected sort of, he's not old per se, but he's, one of the respected sort of elders of his society, one of the people that are on top socially, and he accidentally kills someone, gets exiled to his mother's clan, spends 7 years there with his entire family. They all move across and then they come back, and colonialism has started to trickle into Nigerian society and have those effects upon society, which of course we know were not particularly great. So I think it's a really cool book because it just does so much. It's a very economical book. It's only 150 pages, but I think Chinua Achebe's writing style is just, it just elucidates so much information in such an economical way that makes it a really nice read, but a really tight read as well. And it just does so much. And obviously you've got the great duality there about Nigerian society and then colonialism coming into it, and sort of the duality between the two societies and the contrast between them. And I think that is sort of where this book really just elevates itself, because at the moment, especially at the moment I should say, there is kind of like a decline in the middle ground between us. It does feel like a lot of people are either like, you're either left or you're right, and if you're not right, you're wrong. There is a decline in the middle ground, and a lot of people are less happy to engage in conversations, open discourses and dialogues. A lot of people are kind of like, no, if you believe anything on the right or if you believe anything on the left, if you agree with this person or that person, then you're immediately kind of like mentally blacklisted, which, I mean, obviously anyone can do what they want. That's their prerogative to exercise those kind of freedoms upon their own life. It is not something I necessarily agree with because, one, I quite enjoy debates and dialogues and understanding people's different kind of perspectives on lives and trying to not necessarily agree with them, but understand where they're coming from, because sometimes people do have valid reasons for believing certain things, or they just might find something interesting. for instance, the other day I was talking to someone about Jordan Peterson, who, is a very controversial character. And they said a red flag for them was if a guy liked Jordan Peterson, like anything about him. And I, wanted to play a bit of devil's advocate. I said, but what if, they agree with some things, but not all things, because, he's a very outspoken person that has thousands of hours of lectures and seems to be just speaking on every podcast in the world at the moment. He's got a lot of opinions about a lot of things. If they like one thing about him, is that still a deal breaker? And they were like, yes, that's still a deal breaker. And to me, that is just, it's kind of baffling, I guess, because I'm like, well, it's I don't know, it's just kind of finding that middle ground between it, which I think is really, really tough. That's not me saying I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson. I think he has a lot of controversial opinions that I definitely don't agree with, but I can't say I disagree with everything he says, because at the end of the day, he is still a clinical psychologist that I'm sure has some very reputable positions on things that I just don't understand. I feel like that we've just gotten a bit off track, but basically, that's what it does so well. It portrays both societies very honestly. And you sort of get to the stage where colonialism is trickling into this book, and it highlights it in a way that, even though we're reading it from a modern perspective and we know colonialism is bad, it's presented in a way that feels very, very honest, and kind of highlights that, okay, we know colonialism is bad and we know that what they did was bad, but that doesn't mean that this Nigerian society was right. Just because this is wrong doesn't make us right. And I think that's really important and a really interesting perspective to take. I will sort of speak in depth about that in a bit more in a second. I'm not just going to leave it at that. But I think it was just that ability to sort of present both sides of the story in a really honest way that made it really, really interesting. So, something else that it also does as well is it presents this sort of moral question about societies, about people's external influences upon society. It's also explored in a book by Hanya Yanagihara called The People in the Trees, or All the People in the Trees, I think, where these, again, it's a scientific mission, I think, but they're white and they go into the jungle or whatever it is, and they come across a lost society. And within that society, they're performing an act that we find in our culture reprehensible, and it's a ceremony that we would not agree with. And so, but in their society, it's completely socially acceptable. So it presents that question of what moral right do we have as a society to inject ourselves into another society and say this is wrong? And I think that's what it really kind of highlights in this book, is there are elements to this Nigerian society that are not really conducive to a healthy society by our modern standards. So what right do we have as the colonialists to go into this society and make that argument? So, I'm going to get into it, I think. I'm going to start with a quote because I think this highlights Chinua Achebe's beautiful writing style, but also the economy and the ability to capture Okonkwo as a character. And therefore, if he's seen as a senior member within this society, within this culture, we then get sort of a portrait as to what this culture is actually like. So this is the quote. It appears on page 10 and continues on to page 11. Okonkwo ruled his household with a heavy hand. His wives, especially the youngest, lived in perpetual fear of his fiery temper, and so did his little children. Perhaps down in his heart, Okonkwo was not a cruel man, but his whole life was dominated by fear, the fear of failure and of weakness. It was deeper and more intimate than the fear of evil and capricious gods and of magic, the fear of the forest and the fear of forces of nature, malevolent, red in tooth and claw. Okonkwo's fear was greater than these. It was not external but lay deep within himself. It was the fear of himself, lest he should be found to resemble his father. Even as a little boy, he resented his father's failure and weakness, and even now he still remembered how he had suffered when a playmate had told him that his father was Agbala. That was how Okonkwo first came to know that Agbala was not only another name for a woman, it could also mean a man who had taken no title. And so Okonkwo was ruled by one passion, to hate everything that his father Unoka had loved. One of those things was gentleness, and another was idleness. And so straight away we get this very clear image of what he is like as a man, pretty much a toxic man by textbook definitions. He views he views physical strength and being able to exercise that physical strength as being a man, and that is what being a man is all about. And even though his father is incredibly idle and owed a lot of people money and is, kind of not very responsible for himself or his own family, which is, of course, not something to be proud of. He was incredibly gentle as well, but because they're kind of mingled together and that's what his father looked like, he perceives this gentleness as weakness, and so being gentle in himself is something he doesn't want to be. He just wants to be physically strong. And we see that a few pages later on page 19 when Anoka, his father, is actually dying. And his father sort of, in their last, or in his last stages, he starts to talk a lot and starts to sort of, I guess, profiteer some advice. And his father says, "Do not despair. I know you will not despair. You have a manly and proud heart. A proud heart can survive a general failure because such a failure does not prick its pride. It is more difficult and more bitter when a man fails alone." Unoka was like that in his last days. His love of talk had grown with age and sickness. It tried Okonkwo's patience beyond words. And I mean, that there is such a beautiful line. It is more difficult and more bitter when a man fails alone. And that's such an honest sentence to have. And it's obviously a father trying to pass on a piece of advice to his son that he can see has just been ruled by this physical strength and this physical need to dominate. And he's like, actually, if you do this, if you don't show kindness to your family and gentleness to your family, you're going to feel ultimately alone. But Okonkwo just can't recognize that. He sees this gentleness as kind of a weakness, and therefore he doesn't want anything to do with it. And even though his father is speaking a really honest line there, he doesn't have the mental fortitude to forgive anything in his father, and it tries his patience beyond words. So, again, two little passages that I think just completely sum up Okonkwo as an individual, but then also what's kind of like permissible in this society. He beats his wives, he beats his kids, and that's permissible in this society. And it's this kind of going back to the question of what is our moral responsibility coming in externally into a society where women are being beaten and there's multiple wives and the kids are being beaten, and these men kind of rule this society in a very, very dictatorial position. What is our moral responsibility towards these women and these kids who suffer under this idea of hierarchical structure? Do we have any kind of right to step in? If the women are in the society and they think it's just an aspect of society that is incredibly normal to them, should we just be leaving it alone? So I found that it's such a big and interesting question, and I don't think there's really a great answer for it because, how could you answer it? I guess you could say, if the women are presented with the option to leave, that's different. But there's so much going on in this story that just makes it such a layered society, and it's such a subtle story as well. The subtlety of actions that start to happen. It's a subtlety, even though Okonkwo is not a subtle character. He's quite big and overt and over the top. It's the subtle actions that he does that really kind of define the story, and then it's the subtle actions of the colonizers coming in and their subtle actions within the society as they start to subtly slide in and they start doing little things here and little things there as they weasel their way into this society. And it's just such a beautiful book because it's never in your face in a really violent way. There are a few violent scenes, but it's never really in your face and not posing itself as this incredibly violent story, despite the fact that there is violence in it. It's the subtlety of the story and the subtlety in the way the story flows and evolves and peels back these different layers of society and presents different pictures of society that make it just one of the most interesting and questioning books I think I've read in recent history. And then just, I guess, speaking on the subtlety as well, there's a lot that in this book I guess I didn't quite understand as well, I guess. And I guess it's just that subtlety of actions. Are they lost in the cultural understanding of what's going on? And that's sort of, I guess, the perspective the Christian missions would have had coming into this, the subtlety of this Nigerian society would have been lost upon them. But then it's colonialism coming in, and that's frustrating because they're more technologically advanced, so therefore they're stronger, but they're not more culturally advanced. They're who's to say who's more culturally advanced in different ways? You can't really. Well, I don't think you can really measure cultures on who's more advanced or who's not. So they're more technologically advanced, of course, by technological standards, and that makes them more powerful, and they have this power to come in and impose themselves upon this society, but they're not more culturally advanced. And so now, just speaking about the subtlety of the text, there's just, a couple of lines here that captures exactly how colonialism sort of started to weasel its way into society. And this is on page 115. These outcasts, or Osu, seeing that the new religion welcomed twins and such abominations, thought that it was possible that they would also be received. And so one Sunday, 2 of them went to the church. There was an immediate stir, but so great was the work that the new religion had done among the converts that they did not immediately leave the church when the outcasts came in. And so you see the subtlety there, these outcasts or Osu, these people, they welcome twins and such abominations because being a twin is an abomination that you'd be outcast from society. They get welcomed into the church. And it's this really conflicting line because you're like, especially from a modern perspective, the absolute atrocities that colonialism committed in their quest to take over. But then you get this brilliant couple of lines where you're like, oh, but they welcomed in people that would have been otherwise outcast for no reason other than being a twin. And you start to question Nigerian society in a way, or this particular cultural society in a way that you're like, okay, maybe there was some benefits to colonialism. And then you're kind of like, no, but they were terrible people. They did terrible things. And I think this is what I mean by the death of the middle ground is it's such an interesting book because it raises these questions and presents both sides in a very fair and equal manner that makes it a really engaging read and a really great book to discuss. I'm trying to not talk too much about the story, but I will say this. If you're thinking of reading this, I think the ending, and I'm quite literally mean like the last paragraph of the story, is one of the best endings in a book I've ever read. I think it was absolutely heartbreaking and shattering, and it wasn't even heartbreaking or shattering. It's just kind of like a gut punch that someone punches you in the gut and then all of a sudden there's just like no air left in you and you're not even making a sound. You're just trying to like get that air back in. And it was just such a gut punch that left you breathless. And, I've been quite fair in saying that this story is quite fair, but the last paragraph of the story definitely, I guess, realigns you to the dangers of colonialism and what they actually committed, because it is just, it's an absolutely heartbreaking story that kind of encapsulates the entire story that we've just read, and it sums it up in a paragraph. And it's, even though it's been incredibly fair throughout the story, the previous 150 pages has been exploring this life of Okonkwo and the struggles he feels as an individual and how that's presented through society. Even though we've just done it all, it's then summed up in this last paragraph, and you realize that what we lost in colonialism is these stories and the fabric of these societies and the nuance and the subtlety of them. So, I mean, I thought it was an absolutely fantastic book. What would I rate this out of 5? I would honestly say like a 4.8 out of 5. I thought it was bang on, near perfect. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. It's going to be really tough to beat this book for the rest of the year, I think. This could be one of my favorite books of the year. Thank you so much for listening. Just as a reminder, next month I will be doing Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. I will read this book, talk about this book, and then of course I will compare the 2 books to see if there's any similarities, any differences, what I noticed, what I didn't notice. And yeah, it's always sort of my favorite episode to do because I get to compare the pairs. So I will see you, did I say next month? I think I said next month. It's actually in 2 weeks' time. This is the other May book. So stay with me there. I will then also be announcing what culture I will be heading to, what country I will be heading to in June. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. I really do appreciate it, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers.